Good morning, everyone. I am Zakelem Tembu, and I am joined by Senior Associate Academic Extraordinaire Dr. Morné Malan, and he's here today to discuss his paper. We are discussing his paper, Lean but Efficient. Outside of the cool name, the paper really contends that our state, the South African bureaucracy, has grown way too big, too costly, too intrusive, and we need to cut it down, make it lean, make it much more efficient. Now, of course, if you're a regular watcher of everything that we do here at home, you would know that these are ideas that we are huge proponents of. If you remember, we are still in the midst of, presenting our Liberty First project, whose link to that website should be available in the chat. And Dr. Morné Malan's paper is part of the Liberty First project and specifically dealing with the size of government, as the name implies. And as such, let us, really get right into it. Firstly, Dr. Monet, tell us why. Why did you decide to write this paper? Why do you think that the size of the state should be smaller and everything like that?
Yeah, thanks. First, thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah, I think the economic challenges faced by South Africa, they're very well known. Whether it's stagnant growth, the fact that we've been struggling to reach 1% GDP growth on an annual basis for really years upon years now. Unemployment, of course, always in the headlines, but increasingly also the fact that our debt is becoming really is accelerating, and it's becoming increasingly less sustainable going forward. And our contestation in the paper is that beyond the policy missteps, beyond the issues with policy in and of itself, there's also just a issue of the size of the state, and that's the issue with the size of the state also relates to the scope of the state, which is the amount of influence the state has within the economy. And as the state grows, so also does the level of encroachment upon economic activity. And the reason why we're arguing specifically for size of government and for a reduction in the size of the state, particularly in the executive, particularly in the cabinet, is because that yields what we call a double dividend. It's not just about the fiscal impact of the reduction in salaries, the reduction in all of the administrative bloat and so forth, but it's also about reducing the impact of those agencies, because I like to call it's sort of a Chekhov's cabinet position. Just like you have Chekhov's gun in literature or in theater, if the gun's there in the first act, it has to go off by the third act. The same holds true for cabinet positions. When there is a position, when you hold a position, you feel you have to use it. You can't just be in a position and not actually exercise your power. And that's what we've seen, particularly now in the GNU, is this tendency to just do something. And unfortunately, that tendency to do something often means that it comes at the cost of private innovation. It comes at the cost of real efficiency in the overall market. And that's why we focused on this paper in particular, because we believe it's not just about policy, it's also about the fiscal arrangement of the executive, but most importantly, it's about that regulatory creep, that the perpetuation of red tape in the South African economy.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is a great segue actually when we're talking about fiscal sustainability to really, because in the paper you mentioned that the public sector consumes nearly one third of GDP, right, at 32%. Please tell us, why is that fiscally unsustainable?
Yes, well, I mean, it's purely fiscally unsustainable because we can't sustain the debt that we currently have. And part of the issue there is not just that you run the risk of defaulting, or you run the risk of people not being willing to take on your debt anymore, but it's also the fact that it crowds out private investment. And that's actually something we've seen throughout the world. And part of the paper was also to look at international benchmarks, to look at historical events, historical developments in economies across the globe, and also to look at more analytical approaches, to look at what the literature actually says regarding government spending. And it's quite clear that South Africa is whilst it's below OECD averages, it's far higher than what international organizations, whether those be institutions such as the IMF or the World Bank, or even specifically think tanks that study economic policy, or even universities that study efficient economic policy and so forth. Doesn't really matter where you look. Everybody will tell you the same story. South Africa's state is far too large given the size of its economy. The South Africa has over 30 ministries, which, when compared to countries with far larger economies, countries with far larger populations, even, you can see that we are entirely out of whack. And the other point is not just the size, but also not just the degree of spending, but also the kind of spending that we're making. So in South Africa, a huge amount of public spending goes towards salary. A huge amount of public spending goes towards, actually more consumption. At the moment, the state grows in order to perpetuate just more consumption by public sector bureaucrats, public sector employees, and so forth. Whereas in other countries, you see the norm is far more to invest in more productive assets. So those really are things that you have to keep in mind. It's not just the degree of spending, which is already way above the norm. As according to the best research, South Africa is supposed to be closer to around 25% of GDP, if that. At the top end, it should be at about 25% of GDP, your general government spending, whereas at the moment, like you said, it's around a third. And with that, then of course, the fact that a huge amount of that goes towards actually just financing the consumption of government officials, as opposed to investing in infrastructure, investing in actual services. And that's another point that one has to make here, is that there is this tendency to think that reduction in the size of the state would necessarily mean that there's also a decrease in the amount of services that we've had, or that we receive. Well, I think first of all, you have to say that the state has grown enormously in South Africa, and that has coincided with a huge decline in service delivery. And I don't think that is necessarily a it's not as big of a paradox as one would think. And that's because we've looked at other countries, and in other countries we saw the same thing. The state, when it's focused, when it does have a clear idea of what its core functions are, and when it's allowed to allocate resources within those functions, it immediately becomes more efficient. So it's not an accident that the larger the state grows, the more inefficient it becomes. It's actually exactly what you would expect in that situation.
Mm. Nah, I mean, great points, right? Like the point about how the state has grown and service delivery has declined is something to truly think about, because a lot of people do raise the point that, oh, I'll have services taken away should, government size decrease. But like beyond the actual technicalities, the numbers, the economic side of it, which is really great. Part of your paper, right, makes the case that the size and scale of the government is a moral issue, actually. And please explain to us, why is that an ethical issue? Why is the size of the government an ethical issue?
Yes, well, beyond the fact that it has this extremely negative impact on GDP growth, which again, people shouldn't think of GDP growth as merely a statistic. It does translate into actual people being jobless, people living in penury, people continuing to live in poverty. All those figures that we hear, unemployment at exorbitant levels, economic growth virtually non-existent, and all of those various factors. Those are actual human impacts. But more than that, it's the fact that you know you're actually taking funds, you're taking decision making, you're taking power away from the citizens in order to fund the consumption habits of government officials, which is just entirely immoral. We might get accused of promoting austerity. I'm fine with that in any case. But the fact is that this is something closer to a form of restitution. It's actually taking money away from the government and giving it back to the citizenry, taking power away from the government and giving it back to the citizenry. All of these reforms aren't about taking services away. We still believe that there are certain core functions beyond the functions that are mandated by the Constitution in any case. There are certain core functions that the government can and maybe even should deliver. But the fact is that everything else, anything else you put into that bucket, which necessarily means it's going to be done less efficiently, all of that has a highly moral component. It does mean that there will be more people in poverty. That does mean that there will be fewer people who receive basic services, and does mean it's going to be even harder to get a job. And I just want to emphasize that point I made in those. I think it was in the opening remarks. Um, what we're asking for is actually it's not nearly as radical as it's often portrayed as. We're actually just proposing that we realign ourselves with international norms. At the moment, what we have is, at the moment we're an outlier. We're an outlier in terms of the size of the government when it comes to spending. We're an outlier in terms of the size of the government as a proportion of total employment. We're a massive outlier when it comes to the size of the executive. And on the other hand, we're also a massive outlier when it comes to very poor economic outcomes. So what do you expect? I mean, it couldn't be more clear. And what we're saying is stop being an outlier on the one end, align yourself with international benchmarks, and you're likely to get the same output. We've given this extremely abhorrent and extremely uh, peculiar and strange and entirely out of line input, and we've gotten a strange, peculiar, undesirable input, and we're getting this poor output. And we're saying that unless you change that input, you're not going to change the output, which is something that again also has to happen as quickly as possible.
Wow. I think, yeah, great point. Great point. Outside of all of us who are mathematically challenged, when numbers are being discussed, it's always nice to hear the ethical side of things. It's much more easier to digest, right? You see the problem when it is presented in words for some of us rather than when it is presented in numbers, and for others, it is the other way around. But I think that's a very good point in showing really that there's a cost, right? So all of these things, policy decisions do have a cost, and the costs are pretty dire, as South Africa's current economic situation indicates. But really moving on to South Africa's current reality, right? We currently have, I think, 32 ministers and 37 deputies, right? So, like, really, my question is, firstly, how did we get there? Because I think you kind of touch on that in the paper. And what are like the practical fiscal costs of maintaining such like a large executive? Like 32 ministers and 37 deputies is a pretty big cabinet. So, yeah, those are the questions.
Yeah, so just to put that into perspective, 32 ministries, roughly 37 deputy ministers, it's entirely out of line with international norms. A country like Germany, which has a far larger economy, manages to govern with only 17 ministries. The UK, which is actually renowned as having a fairly large government, is actually only at 22. And even amongst our neighbors, Namibia recently uh, reshuffled or restructured their cabinet, and they're only at 14. But even global powerhouses, stories of economic success, stories where you've really, which are sort of held up as the examples of economic flourishing, countries like Singapore, New Zealand. Those are all countries with very small governments and, very small executives and relatively small governments as well. So that's just to show, we're out of line in terms of the actual figures there. The other thing is that when it comes to the cost itself, one really has to distinguish between, on the one hand, the direct costs of sustaining the government, of sustaining the executive at its current levels, and then those indirect costs. In terms of the direct costs, we estimate it could be just over or roughly around 1 billion rand annually to keep the government, and that means the ministries um, and all of the various support staff and the fringe benefits and so forth to sustain that. In terms of the indirect costs, it's a vast multiple of that. Once you get rid of those ministries, once you get rid of the redundancies between various ministries, which is another issue, we estimate that you could save up to a percentage point in GDP annually, which, I mean, in a country where you've hardly reached 1% of GDP growth is enormous. It doesn't sound that much, but still, that multiplies and that compounds over years. And really, I think, if I had to be honest, it's a fairly conservative estimate, but it's one that I'll certainly be willing to defend. So, in terms of those direct costs, it's not as high as one might expect, but that doesn't mean that what we're proposing is simply a symbolic cutting of the cabinet because it sends a nice message. Sending a positive message is good in and of itself, but it's really about those indirect costs, those costs which pertain to redundancies, which pertain to conflicting forms of regulation between various departments that regulate similar sectors, and especially also the compounding of regulation, which really makes it more and more difficult for South Africans to actually get the economy going.
Ah, okay, okay. So really, our economy, our cabinet is pretty huge, and even though the direct costs may not be as bad, the overall impact of having such a large cabinet really is, something that, well, we can measure if we implement the reforms that you propose, and we can get 1% growth. I know everyone in South Africa, at least if you understand the problems that we have, where they stem from, we would give everything for 1% growth. We would, man, it would be a good day, I guess, in South Africa that day. So there's
Yeah,
that. But let us, I think, since we've touched on like
yeah.
the
So,
actual, oh, okay, you
yeah,
can
just on
come
that,
in.
just on that point, because I didn't mention this particular example. South Africa has a larger cabinet than the United States on a federal level. I mean, that is the largest economy in the world. It's the by far the largest economy in the world. It contributes a massive percentage of global GDP. And South Africa has a larger cabinet than the United States. South Africa also has a far higher proportion of public sector employment than the United States. So, I mean, you'd really struggle to find a successful economy that has a larger, more bloated executive than South Africa. In fact, I couldn't find any.
Well, I do. I guess, South Africa is number one again, so shout out to us. We are a cut above the rest, whether for the best or for the worst. So I guess we'll take that. But I think since, as I was gonna say, that we've touched on like, the general context, we've identified why big governments are a problem. And actually, the international examples, I think the example of Namibia is a good one, really, as a segue into my next question, which really is the reforms that you propose in the paper, right? Namibia reformed and like pretty much merged ministries, reduced the size of their cabinets. And this is something that you also propose in the paper. You propose that we should, cut the 32 ministries down to 10, and really make it as lean, as efficient as possible. Why did you settle on 10, really? And why do which mergers? Because to me personally, really the question is like, what do you think is the most urgent merger that is needed, right? As a point of interest, like, if you were president, which would be the first one that you would do, and why did you settle on the 10?
Yeah. Um, geez, I couldn't choose one.
Fair,
It's like the
fair.
opposite of having to choose between your favorite child. It's choosing between your least favorite. I don't know what.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't know where to start necessarily. But in terms of the cabinet that we suggest, we believe there is more than enough scope to cut the cabinet down to 10 core portfolios. These are the portfolios we believe actually provide a service. These are also the portfolios that have the least amount of overlap, or that allow for the least amount of overlap between various functions. So we have there on the screen our proposed cabinet. We keep the presidency, the finance ministry, which of course will get a expanded role. So a lot of the functions currently delivered by, say, the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, those functions can all be done by the Minister of or they can at least partially be done by the Minister of Finance, International Relations, and so forth. So these are, and in the paper we go into more detail about how one actually consolidates and how one scraps these various departments. But the fact is that many of these departments, and those are chiefly those under the scrapping section, are departments where there's a huge amount of overlap. They're departments where in other countries, in fact, in most countries, that might be a specific unit within a larger ministry, certainly not a ministry in and of itself. So when it comes to Department of Public Enterprises, when it comes to communication, digital tech, women, youth, and persons with disabilities, the norm, for example, when it comes to those more population groups, ministries, well, the norm is not to have one. That's a fact. But I mean, core protections for those ministries, for those groups, could easily fall under justice, and the rest of it can be regulated, as need be. But the fact is, we don't need nearly as many ministries as we have, and maybe I should just mention also that because I don't think I answered that previous question of yours of how cabinets tend to grow, and the fact is that bloated cabinets very rarely occur due to an actual governance need, the actual necessity for governance in a particular industry or anything like that. They more often than not, and in South Africa in particular, they emerge because of political patronage, of coalition politics, of everything except actual governance. So, I mean, these ministries often exist merely for the fact that they create employment and they allow for the consumption of those within the department. Now, I don't think it's necessarily we need to go through every single ministry there, but the fact is that this is a far more um, comparable to international norms than the current cabinet we have. And it also means that uh, we're not really giving up many of the functions. We're actually just consolidating those. We don't have the conflicting versions of regulation between, say, the Department of Small Enterprises, the Department of Trade and Industry, the Department of Finance, the Department of whatever. If you're in a particular industry, there's quite often a regulator for that industry itself. And all of those things mean it's almost impossible to do business. And you can see that. You can see it's almost impossible to do business because people aren't doing business. So once you consolidate those, you streamline and you actually reduce the amount of red tape, and you reduce the transaction costs for actually doing business in South Africa. Because in South Africa, whether you look at the ease of doing business index, where Stone last, whether you look at the Heritage Foundation index, where in terms of economic freedom, where I think we're around 103rd in the world and last in sub-Saharan Africa, even the Fraser Institute index, it's almost as though the entire world is telling us that we're doing something wrong. The data are telling us that we're doing something wrong, and yet we still persist. So this is our proposal for the cabinet. We believe that it's still, manifestly possible, even within a GNU environment, well, perhaps not a GNU environment, but certainly a coalitional environment, to maintain a cabinet of this size. It's still possible to allocate, and in fact, it actually means that for your junior partners in the coalition, it often means that they're going to have a larger impact on policy, a larger impact in the government itself than they do at present. So there's actually an incentive for those junior partners to adopt this approach as well. So rather than them being entirely opposed to it. I think that there certainly are very good reasons for particularly those junior partners, but really for all of South Africa to say, let's cut cabinet. Let's at least, if let's start by sending the signal that we're serious about reform, and then actually do it, and the results will follow.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a pretty great point, right? On sending the signal about being serious for reform. And to my previous point that South Africa leads again, whether for the worst or for the best, right? We are dead last in the ease of doing business. Unfortunately, that I'm pretty much aware of, the Fraser Institute ranking, the Heritage Foundation ranking. Yeah, we are number one, but last. Depends on your perspective, of course. But in the paper, you mentioned that, we could potentially save 5 to 10 billion, right, rands by like instituting these reforms and cutting cabinet down to that size. I thought that was, pretty cool. So if you could touch on that, but really focusing on the like what on the lessons that we can draw, right, from in the paper you mentioned New Zealand's reforms in the 1980s and Chile's deregulation policies. So what lessons can we learn from all these other places that have actually taken this route that you're suggesting?
Yeah, definitely. It's actually quite a bit more than the 5 to 10 billion. That's
Oh.
in fact, if you account for those indirect costs, if you account for a little bit of a multiplier effect based on those indirect costs, you likely see up to around 50 billion rand annually. And of course, we propose that those savings be allocated either to tax relief. I mean, you could certainly take VAT down a couple of percentage points, or to be allocated to debt reduction, which is a ever accelerating threat to our economic prosperity in the country. So that's in terms of just those figures there. In terms of the historical precedents, I mean they abound. Um, in Europe, in particular, in post World War II, there was a split between countries. Those that streamlined their governments, those that cut spending, those that reorganized their war ministries, their wartime cabinets, and all of those saw enormous growth. Particularly, even in the case of a country like Germany, which was virtually decimated after World War II, but experienced what's often called an economic miracle. Same thing with Ireland. The same holds true for numerous other examples. But even outside of Europe, countries like Chile, Chile managed through reducing the size of government, through vast deregulation, through simplifying their codes, and just generally making it easy to do business in the country. They saw an enormous growth in exports. They saw an enormous growth in foreign direct investment, and yeah, that was around. I can't. It would have been around the 70s for Chile post World II, for those European countries, and more recently even a country like New Zealand. They underwent a massive reform agenda. Privatized SOEs. They cut the size of government, cut the scope of government, and the results speak for themselves. They saw enormous growth in economic activity and in economic prosperity. So you can really look across the globe, and you'll see that countries that reduce the size of government tend to increase the amount of economic activity. And that's true not just compared to other countries, that's true that's true within the country itself. A country like Ireland, for example, has recently receded and has actually started growing the size of its government more recently. And as that's happened, you've also seen the trend towards a more sluggish form of economic growth. So like I said, the examples abound. Whether you're looking at analyses, those tell you that our government is overspending. They also tell you that when governments overspend, it harms economic growth. In fact, there are quite a few studies that say once uh, government spending breaches 35% of GDP, regardless of the size of the economy, whether it's an advanced economy, a developing economy, or what have you, um, that has a negative impact on economic growth. And we, as a developing economy, as a middle income economy, we're very close to that level already. Uh, so in terms of spending, we're way out of line. In terms of the kind of spending, we certainly don't uphold international standards. And like you said, Zakes, you can look across the globe and you'll find examples of countries where once you reduce the size of government, you start to grow the economy. And it really is as simple as that. It really is the case that um, government, up to a certain point, can be a boon, but once it breaches that point, it becomes far more of a millstone around the neck of the economy. It makes it far more difficult to to do business in that country and to grow the economy. And again, that's true for relatively efficient governments. And I don't think that anybody would make the argument that we have a particularly competent and particularly energetic or particularly efficient government in South Africa. And partially that's because it has continued to grow despite its lack of service delivery. There's almost this perverse incentive in South Africa where there's not almost, there is in fact, in government, there's this perverse incentive where the inability to deliver on your on your objectives, the inability to deliver the services you're supposed to deliver, is actually rewarded. You can't. You're supposed to get water to people's homes. If you can't do it, the outcome is you'll receive more funding, which is absolutely ridiculous. What do you expect to find if that's the way you're running the government? So really, you have to slash the government, not only to allow the private sector to be more efficient, to allow more resources to go into the private sector, but also to increase the amount of accountability in the government itself. Because when you do have these overlapping ministries, when you do have these redundancies within various departments and ministries, that also means that accountability is virtually impossible to determine. When you have four different ministries all regulating the same thing, then who do you blame when you don't have, when the roads aren't being fixed, when electricity isn't being generated, when water isn't being brought to people's homes? It's less clear. So you need to clear up, you need to decrease the size of government, also to increase the amount of accountability by government actors itself.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, no, I think that is an amazing point, right, on accountability because, yeah, in South Africa, if you can't deliver water to a community, as you say, they give you more money, and then more money, and then more money, whilst you buy blue Lamborghinis, as we recently saw. So there's that. But in the paper, you mentioned a 3-year roadmap, right, into really what we should follow to achieve all of these ends that are really wonderful for everyone who is concerned about the future of the country. So please walk us through this 3-year roadmap. How can we take ourselves outside of this road to serfdom?
Yes, yeah, I think that we really took the actual implementation of the policy quite seriously, and we recognize that in order for it to be politically feasible, you have to actually have a plan for how you're going to implement these reductions, because it will have a disrupting effect, not only for those in government. Obviously, it'll have a massively disrupting effect, although you can argue that that's a positive disruption, but it can also have a disruptive effect in terms of the uncertainty within the private sector as well. Now, it sends a good signal. It means that we're taking reform seriously, but it can mean that in the interim, if it's over hasty, then it can mean that that people can be uncertain as to what is required. Business people can be uncertain, entrepreneurs can be uncertain as to what is actually required of them, and who to approach with their various requests. So we propose a 3-year rollout plan. We've divided those up into 3 different phases, and it actually dovetails with some of our other recommendations as well. So in year 1, we propose that we start by first conducting a comprehensive audit of the ministries and their functions, and we freeze those regulatory mandates until there's more clarity, and we've reached the next phase where it's clear where those regulatory powers will vest going forward. And then we already in year 1, we're saying prepare consolidation proposals. So do an audit of the ministries in government and prepare consolidation proposals in year 1 already. Year 2, you're already prepared to implement those mergers, to implement those closures, scrap the departments that need to be scrapped, merge the departments that need to be merged. We're also suggesting that, we're actually saying that we need to have a form of sunset clause for regulations. Regulations can't just be allowed to remain in effect in perpetuity. What happens is you get this intervention layer cake. It's one level of intervention. You realize that level has gone a bit crooked, so you try to put a new level of intervention on top of that, and so forth until the whole thing collapses under its own weight. So we propose that they be consistent, or they actually be mandated sunset clauses, so that every time especially regulations relating to economic activity are promulgated, those need to be sunsetted. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to fall away, but it does mean that we have to continuously be justifying intervention as opposed to justifying a reduction in intervention or reduction in interference in the economy. So that's that. Implement the allocate those savings. We again, year 2, determine the amount of savings that you're going to have, and draw a plan as to how you're going to spend those savings. It should be in time for the budget itself. Year 3, that's where we're at the point where we can consolidate our gains. We can actually privatize, or where need be, liquidate a lot of the SOEs, because that's also part of the proposal, is that a ministry such as public enterprises really only justifies its existence through the management of very poorly performing SOEs. And once those SOEs are privatized, once those SOEs are liquidated, that means we don't need the department itself anymore. We need to embed a requirement for economic impact assessments for all regulations, and we need to also prevent the reoccurrence of that regulatory sprawl, which is where what we propose is, on the one hand, on the spending side, is what we call a 2/3 rule, which means that we cap government spending at 25% of GDP, which has been shown to be the optimal level, and any increase above that, anytime government wants to spend more than 25% of GDP, we require a 2/3 majority of Parliament in order to accept that proposal, and that's easily implementable through Parliament itself. The other point on regulation, we suggest that government adopt a one in, two out rule. This was sort of popularized by the Trump administration, although they certainly weren't necessarily the inventors of the notion. The fact is that they're not that original, I suppose. But it's an example that has been followed in the past. Like I said, it's just this regulatory sprawl. It's the fact that you're in a position your job is to regulate. So each year you feel the need to develop more and more regulation. And often those regulations contradict one another. Often those regulations only make it increasingly difficult to do business in South Africa. A department, a ministry like small business is is probably the single biggest roadblock to small businesses in South Africa at the moment, and that's because rather than supporting small businesses, it attempts to regulate small businesses, and those regulations make it virtually impossible to do business as a small business in South Africa, and you can see that in the results. So a phased approach, take into account that there are certain reliances upon the system as it is at present. But again, don't delay too much. Do it as quickly as possible. Do it as you know as disruptive as it needs to be. I suppose not. Don't minimize the disruption, but optimize the disruption. I suppose is the argument that we're making there. So phase it in, and again, not over the long term, but very much over the short and medium term. And the sooner, the better is really the argument that we're making.
Oh, yeah. I think, optimize disruption. That is cool. We'll probably hear that from, the pitching consultants in Silicon Valley when they're trying to get money out of venture capitalists. Like, yes, it's optimized disruption. It won't destroy things. But in the context of what we're talking about here, I think it is something to keep in mind, right? If you take a look at the challenges that Javier Milei, the greatest president on earth, currently is experiencing in Argentina, and you start seeing how, like, disruption does have certain consequences that will have an effect in your willingness to go ahead with reforms like these. So yeah, I think the 3 year plan and the roadmap is something that's pretty cool. And for anyone who's watching, there's much more in depth in the paper. So please do go and check it out. But I think that is a great way for us, because I think we've covered most, like, the content of the paper. We do seem to have a bit of, like, engagement from our audience. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us today. And our first question is from Leanne, right? And Leanne pretty much saying that politicians won't cut their own jobs. I mean, yeah, I am inclined to agree too, given the nature of self-interest, but we can only hope, right? We can only hope, because their jobs are contingent on us voting for them. But her question really is, should South Africans demand a law to limit cabinet size, right? So should really this plan be instituted in the form of legislation?
Um, Geez, I haven't really considered a law necessarily, but I think that the fact is that at the end of the day, Parliament does have the power to, or they have the actual final say regarding how funds are allocated, and we are actually now in the position where we've only really had a Parliament which has a real contestation between various ideas for the past 8 months since 1994. Previously, the ANC did have an outright majority, which meant that Parliament, for all intents and purposes, did whatever the ANC told it to do. But now we do have a Parliament where the ANC doesn't have a majority. So it isn't necessarily the executive prerogative to decide whether or not to limit the amount of people within the executive. Now, having said that, are politicians going to cut their own jobs? Probably not. It's probably going to be a hard sell. But the fact is, we have to do it. It has to happen. It does mean that those that remain within the cabinet, uh, they do have a larger function than they previously would have. And I think it might actually, given the amount of scandal around current cabinet members, it might actually provide a bit of a relief from that headache if we just say that we're adopting a broader cutting approach. But just it's not just to also mention, it's not as though South Africa's cabinet has never been cut. Even under the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, we did see a cut in cabinet. I believe it was in 2019, where we reduced the size of the cabinet. That was short lived, and that's we've gotten those back and then some. But I mean that's just a test case in terms of the fact that there was no impact on service delivery. It was a very popular political decision. So if you are a political party and you're hoping to get votes, there's one way to do it. Show the citizenry that you're taking spending seriously. Show them that you're willing to sacrifice your own income, or at least the income of some of your cabinet members, in order to um, in order to actually put the prosperity of the country before the prosperity of particular politicians. So I think it could be quite a popular political move, and if nothing else, then politicians do love being popular. So let's hope that between those various considerations, I think there is actually quite a bit of appetite to implement something like this. Thanks, Leanne.
Yeah. No, thank you to Leanne for the question. And our next comment is from Radio Nouvelle. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But
Radio Nivelit.
Radio Nouvelle, there we go. So Radio Nouvelle, right? Has really an opinion slash question, right? He's saying that, do you think that enough people will wake up and change their vote, or do you think the current government will run themselves into the ground and will start from scratch? This is more of a general political commentary, but since we're talking about the government, really it is
Mm.
fitting. But yeah, do you think the South African populace will wake up and be like, hey, let us stop voting all of these patronage, addicted politicians into power and try a different thing? Or really are we looking at just destruction, collapse, and starting off after that?
Yeah, what's that meme that says no? Well, just give anarchy a chance. um, so it's only half joking there. No, I think that firstly, will people wake up and change their vote? I think let's not underestimate the extent to which that's already happened. I think people don't realize how much ANC support has actually dropped in the past 30 years. They were a close to 70% party not that long ago, and they're now a 40% party. And if you believe which I tend to do, I believe they're reliable polls. If those hold, if that carries through to the election, then it seems as though the ANC is closer to a 30% party going forward. So people are changing their voting behavior. Um, but I do think that and it's which should also put pressure on the politicians themselves. You could easily argue that for the politicians at the moment, particularly for those in the ANC, it might be a case of cut the cabinet now, or lose any hope of positions going forward. You could easily see them losing their status as the plurality party in Parliament unless something is drastically done. So it certainly aligns with the interests of the broader party to implement changes such as these, because, like I said, voter behaviour is changing. It might not be changing as fast as we'd like to see, but I think that it does. I think these two things tend to gain speed as they develop, unless the politicians can find some way to channel that momentum into some other direction. So I'm the last one to help a politician, but this is my tip to them, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I know Rothbard would be very cross with you because he was opposed to to libertarians giving politicians tips, right? His entire beef with the Cato Institute was premised on that. But that is a tangent for all the libertarian nerds out there. Really, I think that should be enough for the questions. I did have one of my own, if you can touch on it pretty quickly before we move on to closing remarks. But really, I was thinking if there is any role, since at the Free Market Foundation will always argue for decentralization. So is there any role that provincial governments or any other level of the state, province or municipality can play in making the state much more leaner? As we know, in the Western Cape, for instance, it is governed by a different party. So is there anything that they can do to actualize the, I guess, ethos and the values of what you propose in the paper?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's also a result of the muddled nature of the responsibilities between various ministries, between the various spheres of government, be it at the local level, be it at the provincial level, be it at the national level. The fact is that quite often, and anybody who's had to deal with any of these agencies directly, they'll know that once you speak to the one, they'll tell you, no, no, that lies with the other department. You go to that department, they'll say, no, it's on a different level. And part of streamlining the responsibilities is also about streamlining the accountability. If uh, if the responsibility to deliver a particular service is clearly and unambiguously seated within the local government, then that means that not only do they have the power to actually do what needs to be done, but they also know that they'll be held accountable if they don't. Because, it is also the case that quite often local governments, they simply can't do what needs to be done. Even well-meaning local governments often are stymied by the fact that they have to get approvals, right down the line. They have to take various other factors into account, all of which, let's say none of which relate to the actual delivering of the service itself. So um, it empowers local governments. You have to decentralize a lot of the functions where there are redundancies, and along with that empowerment means there has to be an increase in accountability for those local governments as well. Can I just? I saw one of the comments there
Oh yeah.
said that surely there should be some qualifications to be eligible for parliament. Um, yeah, I get where that comes from. I get the sentiment, but whenever I do see something like that comment, I'm always reminded of a remark by William F. Buckley, who once said when asked who should staff the government, he said that he would rather the first 50 names he happened to come across in the Massachusetts phone book govern than have the top 50 people of Harvard University govern. And I must say that in general, uh, I find might not be a perfect solution, but I think more often than not, the common sense of ordinary people does tend to outperform the highfalutin theories of the, well, let's call them the overeducated, uh, which I suppose I'm in no position to necessarily judge.
Yeah. I was gonna say that you are academic extraordinaire, so I guess you are part of that class now, But yeah,
That's
in
why I'm
most
not
of
in
the problem.
government. Well,
That is
one of the
true.
various reasons.
One of the many reasons, I'm sure,
Yeah.
right? But I think the vision of the anointed, most educated people see themselves as being anointed to lead society, and that usually leads to not so great consequences. Of course, if you believe in liberty for individuals, then you're like, hey, even if you aren't educated, you should be able to at least contest for government within your community, but first of all, govern yourself, right? So there is that. But it has been a great discussion, Dr. Malan. I enjoyed reading the paper. I enjoyed going through it with you. And yeah, I think really in a closing, right, kind of lighthearted remark, really, what would indicate to you, right? Like let's say that you someone is like, hey, South Africa is now lean but efficient. What would you look for? What would be the thing that would characterize South Africa being lean but efficient, right? To use the title of the paper, what would it look like?
Yeah, I think that
What
one of the
would it
benefits.
signal, rather? Yeah, no,
Oh,
no,
what
I'm
would it
sorry.
signal?
Yeah, yeah. What signal are you looking for? What signal is there that would be like that will tell you that South Africa is now actually lean but efficient?
Yeah, I think that the benefit of the way in which we structured the paper is that it has a very tangible measurement of whether or not we're moving in the right direction. And when you do see a reduction in the both the size of the government and the scope of the government, those are extremely positive signs. And I think that in a country where we're so starved for good news, good economic news, and where you do actually have a lot of what you might call idle capital in the private sector, I think even small signals could have a huge impact on economic activity. If you do send those signals, and especially if you then follow up on those signals by actually implementing these policies, I think once we see um, you know reductions in actual ministerial positions, a reduction in the actual cabinet, and a real commitment to um, to actually put the power, like you said, Zakes, to actually allow people to govern themselves. Once we see moves in those directions, and once we see a move away from all of these diffuse and sprawling agencies and ministries, those will all be enormously positive signs. And I think that uh, that's likely to just create a multiplying dividend. That's likely to just rather than the layer cake of intervention, you'll sort of have the snowball of prosperity. How do you like those for some very mixed metaphors?
That is cool. We hope for the snowball of prosperity. That is what that is the end for the advocacy of these ideas that we do have. But thank you, Dr. Malan, for joining us. It is always a pleasure. Thank you to our audience for the great engagement. We really appreciate it a great deal. If any one of you who's watching hasn't subscribed to our channel, please do subscribe. Please do give, this live stream a like, share it if you know anyone who's interested in shrinking the state or rather expanding the state. I think we want to reach the ones who want to expand the state more. So really just share the live stream wherever you can possibly share it. And really for me, it has been a great time joining you all, hosting this discussion. And always remember, stay free.